The first time I realized something was wrong, I was standing in a silent alley behind an old newspaper office, staring at a torn file that someone had tried very hard to burn. The edges were black, the paper warped, but a few lines were still readable, just enough to tell me that the story I'd been chasing wasn't just another rumor. It was bigger. Much bigger. And in that moment, with the cold night air tightening around my chest, I understood one thing clearly. Somebody didn't want this truth to survive. That was the moment everything changed, the moment I decided I would spend every breath I had hunting down the government's mistakes, no matter how deep they were buried. I wasn't always the kind of person who went digging in places people warned me to avoid. I used to be like everyone else, working long hours, minding my own business, trusting that the systems around us were built on something solid. But then I learned something important. The mistakes that shape our lives aren't always accidents. Sometimes they're covered up, patched together, or quietly forgotten. Sometimes they're the type of mistakes that leave cracks big enough for entire lives to fall through. And once I saw one of those cracks up close, I couldn't unsee it. The story really began 2 years ago when my friend Sam disappeared. He wasn't the kind of guy who vanished without explanation. He was steady, predictable, and too responsible to just walk away from his job, his family, everything. When the police shrugged and said they had no leads, people around me accepted it as just another unfortunate situation. But something felt off. The last message I ever got from him was short, rushed, and unusually anxious. If anything happens, don't trust the official report. Look deeper. At the time, I had no idea what he meant. I wish I had paid attention sooner. The more I searched for answers, the more unusual barriers I ran into. Records suddenly missing. People who refused to talk. Conversations that ended the moment I mentioned Sam's name. And then a retired clerk, shaking, nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder, told me the truth in a whisper. Sam had discovered an error in a government system, something so minor on the surface that most people wouldn't even notice. But that tiny mistake spiraled into a chain reaction that affected thousands of lives. Instead of fixing it publicly, someone had tried to quietly bury the problem. And anyone who got too close to revealing it, well, they didn't stay around long. I didn't know what to believe. I didn't want to believe it. But when you hear a frightened man tell you that your best friend saw something he wasn't supposed to, you don't forget it. That was the moment the fear in me transformed into determination. If a mistake, just a single one, could destroy someone's life, how many more were out there? How many stories were sitting in dusty drawers, ignored or hidden because they were inconvenient? I wasn't looking for revenge. I wasn't trying to expose anything dramatic. I just wanted the truth. And sometimes the truth is the one thing the world tries hardest to hide. I started digging quietly, learning how systems work, how old archives are organized, how to trace digital footprints without raising alarms. I didn't break any laws. I didn't hack anything. Everything I found was in the open, just obscured under layers of confusion, bureaucracy, and silence. And what I found shocked me. There were patterns, strange, repeating patterns. A mismatched date here, an unexplained gap there, a name that appeared on one document but magically vanished from another. Each little detail was small on its own, but together they formed a trail. A trail that pointed to a place no one seemed to be watching. As I followed that trail, I learned something else. The government doesn't intentionally hide everything. Sometimes their biggest mistakes are the ones they don't even realize they've made. A wrong signature. A flawed process. A neglected report. A system that hasn't been updated in decades. And while most mistakes don't harm anyone, some slip through in ways that create real consequences. People suffer quietly. Lives change unfairly. And those stories get buried under paperwork until someone decides to dig them out. That became my mission. Not to fight the government, but to uncover the mistakes that hurt everyday people. To understand why they happened and how they were allowed to continue. To follow the stories that others abandoned. And to shine a light in the places where shadows had grown too thick. I never imagined it would pull me into a world of unanswered questions and half-truths, a world where every answer opened a dozen more doors. Along the way, I met people who carried their own experiences, victims of errors no one acknowledged, families confused by contradictions, workers who tried to report problems but were ignored. Their stories fueled me. They gave me purpose. And as I pieced their accounts together, I began to see a bigger picture forming, something that stretched far beyond Sam's disappearance. Something that hinted that his discovery wasn't an isolated mistake, but part of a chain that connected to something far more complicated. The night I found the half-burned file was the night I realized someone else knew I was getting close. That file wasn't just garbage. It was a warning. I remember standing there, hearing the distant hum of city lights, feeling the weight of the paper trembling between my fingers. Someone had tried to destroy it but not thoroughly enough. And what was left behind, it wasn't random. It was deliberate. Like someone wanted me to find just enough to keep digging but not enough to understand the full truth. It felt like bait. Felt like a test. And I walked straight into it. But the fear didn't stop me. If anything, it convinced me that whatever I was chasing was real. Too real. Real enough that someone was already watching. Real enough that the story I was uncovering wasn't just about Sam anymore. It was about a hidden pattern of government mistakes, overlooked decisions, forgotten paperwork, and unintended consequences, each one quietly shaping lives without anyone noticing. I didn't know then how deep the rabbit hole went. I didn't know how many more lives were tangled in this web. All I knew was that I had crossed a line I couldn't return from. And the file in my hand, it contained a name. Just one name. A name I recognized. The moment I saw it, everything around me went still. The noise faded. My heartbeat slowed. Because if that name was truly connected to everything I'd uncovered, then this wasn't just a story of mistakes anymore. It was something far bigger. And that's where the real hunt began. I didn't move for a while after seeing that name on the half-burned page. It felt impossible, like my mind was trying to trick me into connecting dots that didn't belong together. But the ink was still visible, the letters uneven where the fire had eaten away the corners. I traced the name slowly with my thumb, hoping it would change or fade, but it stayed exactly the same. It was a name from my own past, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, someone who had no reason to be in a government file, especially not one that someone tried to destroy. That single detail pulled the ground out from under me. Whatever I had stepped into, it was no longer distant or abstract. It was personal. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my jacket. The alley suddenly felt colder, the shadows stretching farther than they should. I kept telling myself it was just a coincidence, that the name must belong to someone else who just happened to share it, but deep down I knew better. There are coincidences and then there are signs. And this felt like a sign. One pointing straight into a part of my life I thought I had left behind. It made me wonder how far back this mystery went, how many years this trail had been forming without me noticing. When I got home, I spread everything I had collected out on the table. Notes, printouts, old photos, names circled, dates crossed out, threads of a puzzle I had been trying to solve for months. But now, with this new piece, the puzzle didn't just get bigger, it shifted completely. It was like I had been looking at the picture upside down the entire time. I kept going back to the same question. Why him? Why would his name appear in connection with Sam, with the missing records, with the strange patterns I'd been tracking? The connection made no sense. They had never met. Their worlds were different. And yet, there it was, burned but not fully erased. I spent the next few hours digging through old memories, trying to remember anything that could explain the link. And slowly, something surfaced, something faint, almost forgotten. A conversation from years ago. A moment I barely paid attention to at the time. He had once mentioned working on a temporary contract for a department I knew very little about. I remembered laughing it off, telling him government paperwork was boring. He agreed, but there was a pause afterward, one I didn't understand then. Now that pause replayed in my head with new weight. As the night went on, I tried to compare dates from the file with what I knew about his timeline, and the more I matched them, the more uncomfortable I became. Some of the dates overlapped with the same period when Sam first started acting strange. Back then, I thought Sam was just stressed from work, dealing with pressure or office politics. But now, looking at everything layered together, it felt like their paths had brushed against the same hidden issue. The same mistake, or maybe the same secret. And whatever it was, they weren't the only ones affected. 4 days after that, I felt like someone was rearranging my life behind my back. People I tried to ask questions avoided me even more than before. Some gave polite excuses. Others simply froze for a second, then claimed they didn't remember anything. It wasn't normal. The way their eyes flickered, the way their voices dropped. Those reactions told me I wasn't imagining things. Something about the name in that file made people uncomfortable, even afraid. And that fear only confirmed that I was getting closer to a truth nobody wanted to talk about. I started visiting old places connected to him, hoping to find hints he might have left without realizing. A small office building he once worked in. A cafe where he spent hours on his laptop. A dusty storage room behind a public library where he volunteered for a year. Everywhere I went, I found nothing obvious, just everyday clutter, forgotten papers, old receipts. But each place felt strangely hollow, like pieces had been removed recently. Desk drawers wiped clean. Boxes reorganized. Shelves that should have been filled suddenly empty. It felt like someone had come before me, clearing away anything that could point to the truth. Still, even in the emptiness I found small clues. A scribbled note with half a sentence torn off. A list of numbers that looked random at first, but matched some of the dates in the government database. A sticky note inside a book with only one question written on it: why repeat the same error twice? I didn't know what he meant by that, but the question echoed inside me. It made me wonder if the mistake I was hunting wasn't just a one-time accident at all. Maybe it was a pattern, a recurring flaw ignored again and again until people got trapped in its consequences. The deeper I went, the more I noticed how each discovery connected to something else. It was like walking through a maze where every turn led to another clue, another unanswered question. And every question pointed back to the same system, the same quiet corners of government work where tiny oversights could grow into massive problems. I wasn't accusing anyone of doing something intentionally harmful, but I couldn't deny that the results were real. People like Sam were proof. And now, seeing that familiar name appear in the middle of it all, I realized that I might have been close to one of these mistakes without even noticing. One evening, after days of searching, I found something that made my breath catch. It was buried in an old notebook he had left behind at his parents' house. All the pages were filled with messy notes, sketches, questions, things that didn't make sense on their own. But the final page stopped me cold. It said, "If you're reading this, it means I got too close. Look at the revisions from 2015. Start there." That's where everything broke. The handwriting was rushed, uneven, like he wrote it in a hurry. I stared at those words for a long time, feeling my heart beat slower and heavier with each second. The revisions from 2015. I didn't know what he meant, but the date stood out. It matched one of the earliest entries I had circled from Sam's research. It also matched one of the unexplained gaps I found in the archived reports. 3 different people, all tied to the same year. That couldn't be random. Something must have happened in 2015, something that started the cracks forming long before anyone realized they were spreading. I tried searching for public information about the revisions, but everything was vague. Reports mentioning policy adjustments, system upgrades, minor procedural changes. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that explained the fear I had seen in people's eyes. But sometimes the real issue isn't in what's written, it's in what's missing. And the more I looked at those documents, the more missing pieces I noticed. Sections abruptly cut short. Attachments removed. References to earlier drafts that no longer existed. The documents were too clean in a way that felt unnatural. At this point, it wasn't just a hunt anymore. It was a responsibility. If something important had slipped through in 2015 and nobody fixed it, then the consequences could still be unfolding today. Maybe that was what Sam found. Maybe that was what he tried to warn me about. And maybe that was why the file was burned, because someone realized I was following the same trail he did. But even with all the clues, I still didn't understand how the people from my past, the lost records, the missing files, and the unexplained gaps all connected. The truth was close enough to feel, but still just out of reach. Every time I thought I had a clear path, another question rose up to block it. And the more questions I found, the more I felt like someone was quietly steering me, leaving breadcrumbs in places where I would find them, but never enough to solve the full story. I kept going anyway. I had to. Because if Sam disappeared because of what he uncovered, and if someone else I knew had gotten tangled in the same mistake, then walking away wasn't an option. I didn't know what waited at the end of this trail. I didn't know who was watching or how much they already knew about my search. I only knew one thing for sure. The deeper I went, the more it felt like I wasn't just hunting the government's mistakes anymore. It felt like the mistakes were starting to hunt me back. The days that followed felt heavier, like the air itself carried a warning I couldn't quite hear but could definitely feel. Every step I took into the mystery seemed to open another door, each leading into darker and more complicated hallways. And in every one of those hallways something was waiting, something unfinished, something overlooked, something that didn't make sense no matter how hard I analyzed it. The main conflict was no longer about a single missing friend or a few strange documents. It had grown into a bigger question. What exactly had gone wrong inside the system, and how far did the consequences reach? The more I searched, the more it felt like I was dealing with 2 parallel stories that kept brushing against each other. One was about the mistakes the government made, errors hidden under forms, wrong data entries, outdated procedures, reports that contradicted themselves. The other story was much more personal. It was about the people connected to those mistakes, the ones who either disappeared, resigned, or quietly changed their lives after getting too close. So, the person whose name I found in the burned file. A few others whose names appeared in old emails or archived lists. They all had one thing in common: They were connected to the same set of revisions, the same year, the same quiet shift that happened in 2015. But instead of giving me clarity, every clue led to more confusion. I began to see how conflict inside a system can spill into people's lives without anyone realizing. How accountability can be lost in paperwork. How a chain reaction of small oversights can grow into something that no one wants to acknowledge. And while I understood this on a logical level, the emotional part of the conflict kept pulling me back to the same fear. If they were caught in this mess, how long until I was next? I started digging into one of the subplots almost by accident. There was a woman named Layla whose name kept appearing in documents tied to both Sam and the 2015 revisions. I didn't know her personally, but she had once worked in an internal review department. Basically the place where mistakes should have been caught long before they reached the public. When I tried to contact her, the email bounced back. The number listed for her went straight to a disconnected tone. So I decided to look deeper. I found out that she resigned suddenly 7 years ago. No explanation. No farewell message. Her colleagues described her as dedicated, organized, and always the first to point out problems before they got worse. That made her disappearance from the system even stranger. One person even told me she had been working on a sensitive review right before she left, but no one knew what happened with it afterward. Hearing that made something click in my mind. Maybe she had found the same mistake Sam found. Maybe she had warned someone. Maybe she had tried to fix it. And maybe someone decided it was easier if she walked away quietly. The conflict kept branching out like this. One angle leading to another, each more complicated than the last. I didn't want to accuse anyone of doing something intentionally wrong. It was more like a long chain of misunderstandings and mismanagement piled on top of each other until the truth was buried under layers of confusion. But the real question was, why did the people who discovered the truth keep disappearing, resigning, or going silent? One evening, while reviewing all the timelines, I noticed another detail that slipped past me earlier. Every time someone got close to identifying the error, something shifted in their life. A sudden transfer. A change in job role. A missing report. An unexpected resignation. None of these things were dramatic enough to raise alarms on their own, but when placed side by side, they told a story of subtle pressure, like a quiet force pushing people away from the truth before they could reveal it. That realization made me uneasy. Not because I thought someone was actively working against me, but because it suggested the problem was bigger than any one person. Maybe the system was so tangled that whenever someone pulled on the wrong thread, everything around them tightened instinctively. Maybe these mistakes weren't being hidden intentionally, maybe they were just too embarrassing or complicated for anyone to step forward and take responsibility. Still, there were moments when it felt like something, or someone, was paying attention to my movements. Like the time I visited an old office building where one of the archived reports was supposedly handled. I walked in casually, pretending I was just looking for directions. But the moment I mentioned the department's name, the receptionist's smile froze for a split second. It was subtle, but I noticed it. She excused herself to the back room, and after a few minutes, a man came out instead. He was polite, professional, and quick to inform me that the department I mentioned no longer existed. When I asked him when it closed, he said he didn't remember. The whole interaction felt too rehearsed to be random. Another subplot emerged when I went through old emails that Sam had forwarded to himself. Most of them were ordinary, schedules, reminders, internal memos. But one stood out. It was a simple message with no subject. No greeting. Just a single line, check the second update, not the first. I didn't know what update he meant, but something about that message felt important. It had been sent 3 months before he disappeared. When I compared that line to the 2015 files, I found something strange. There were indeed 2 updates. Most people referenced the first one, but the second update was harder to find. It wasn't listed in the public archive. It wasn't in the usual index. I only found it because a small note in the margin of another document mentioned it by accident. But even when I located it, the entire second update was missing from the folder. Only the title remained. Someone had removed it. Not by accident, deliberately. This discovery deepened the conflict. It meant there was something about that second update that someone didn't want anyone to see. Maybe it held the original mistake. Maybe it revealed who approved it. Maybe it contained details that connected every name I had found, every disappearance, every strange behavior. The tension kept building as I realized that the closer I got, the more gaps I encountered. Missing attachments. Unexplained edits. Reports that should have existed but didn't. People who should have remembered things but claimed they didn't. It wasn't a clean cover-up, nothing dramatic. It felt more like the remains of a chaotic system trying to protect itself. One night, as I sat surrounded by papers and timelines, something hit me. Maybe the mistake wasn't a single event in 2015. Maybe it was something older, something that began long before any of us noticed and just happened to show itself that year because someone finally stumbled on the truth. So, Layla, the person whose name appeared in the burned file. And now me. 3 different people from completely different lives, all pulled into the same quiet conflict without realizing it. I thought about stopping. I thought about walking away, pretending none of this mattered. But every time I imagined stepping back, I saw the half-burned file in my mind. I saw Sam's last message. I saw the unanswered questions sitting in front of me. I didn't want to be another person who got close and then gave up. Still, the deeper I went, the stronger the feeling became that someone was just a few steps ahead of me, removing traces, shifting clues, keeping me from reaching the truth too quickly. And the strange part was that they didn't seem angry or aggressive. It was almost as if they were guiding me, controlling the pace at which I discovered things, letting me see small pieces but never the full picture. It was confusing. It was frustrating. And it meant one thing. The real conflict was only just beginning. I didn't expect the next twist to come from something as simple as an envelope. It was sitting at my doorstep when I got home late one evening, tucked neatly under the mat like someone wanted to make sure I found it but didn't want to risk being seen. There was no name on it, no stamp, no return address. Just a blank envelope that felt heavier than it looked. For a moment, I stood there staring at it, my heart beating unevenly, wondering if I should even touch it. But curiosity won, the same way it always had throughout this whole investigation. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once down the middle. No letter. No explanation. Just a printed list of names, 15 of them. And as soon as I saw the second name on the list, a cold wave rolled down my spine. It was the same name I'd found on the half-burned file, the same person from my past whose connection to this government mistake never made sense. Seeing it again wasn't the twist. The twist was that his name was only the second on the list. The first name was mine. For a moment, everything inside me froze still. I stared at the page, hoping it was a prank or some kind of misunderstanding. But the more I read the list, the less random it felt. Sam's name was number 4. Layla was number 9. Other names scattered in between were ones I recognized from old reports, messages, and files I'd been studying for weeks. It was like someone had taken every person who ever got close to the hidden mistake and arranged them in a specific order, an order I didn't understand. At the bottom of the list, in small typed letters, was a message that made my breath catch. "You're moving too fast." That was it. No signature. No threat. Just a simple warning. I reread that line at least 10 times trying to understand what it meant. Too fast for what? Too fast toward the truth? Too fast toward something I wasn't supposed to see yet? Or too fast toward a danger I didn't fully understand? The envelope itself looked harmless, but the meaning behind it wasn't. Someone out there knew exactly what I was looking for. They knew every person connected to the revisions from 2015. They knew how far I'd traced the mistake. And most importantly, they knew I was close. But close to what? I kept inspecting the paper, hoping for more clues, but something else caught my attention instead. The list wasn't printed using a normal font. The letters had a slightly uneven texture, like they came from an old printer or a machine that wasn't used often. It reminded me of the printouts in the archive room of the old department building I visited. A place where those missing documents should have been stored. It made me wonder if the envelope came from someone inside the system, someone who preferred subtle warnings over direct confrontation. That possibility opened up a whole new angle, one that twisted the conflict into something deeper. Maybe not everyone inside the system wanted to hide the mistake. Maybe someone wanted me to find the truth but only in a certain order. Maybe the breadcrumbs I'd been following weren't accidents or oversights. Maybe they were placed intentionally by someone who was trying to guide me more carefully than I realized. But if that was true, then why include my name at the top of the list? I tried to think back to the earliest moment I got involved, the day Sam disappeared. Before that, I had nothing to do with government procedures or old reports. But what if this mistake affected me too long before I even knew it existed? What if my connection wasn't recent at all? The idea made me sit down immediately. It felt impossible, but the list suggested otherwise. It positioned me as the first link, not the last. As if everything started with me. That thought unsettled me the most. Trying to dig deeper, I turned the page over and found something very strange. Faintly pressed into the back, almost invisible unless you tilted it against the light, was an indentation, like someone had written on the paper above it with a heavy hand. It wasn't part of the printed list. It was something written by hand earlier. I held it up under a lamp, and slowly the words became clearer. It wasn't supposed to happen twice. That line hit me like a punch. I'd seen the same idea somewhere else, in that notebook page left behind by the person whose name I found in the burned file. Why repeat the same error twice? He had written. Back then, I didn't understand what he meant. Now I realized he wasn't talking about a small mistake. He was talking about something much larger. A repeated error. A cycle. A system flaw that didn't just slip through once but twice. And I was starting to suspect that the second time involved me. As I sat there piecing things together, a sudden vibration on the floor startled me. It was my phone. An unknown number was calling. Normally, I would have ignored it, but something told me I needed to answer. When I picked up, the line was silent at first. No breathing. No background noise. Just stillness. Then a voice finally spoke, calm, steady, and strangely familiar. "You're not supposed to be at this point yet," the voice said. Before I could respond, the call ended. I stared at the screen, my pulse speeding up. The voice wasn't robotic or disguised. It belonged to a real person. Someone who sounded like they were making a statement, not a threat. But the familiarity of that tone gnawed at me. It felt like a voice I had heard years ago in a completely different context. A voice I never connected to any of this. The call escalated everything. It wasn't just documents missing or names appearing unexpectedly. Someone was actively watching me, actively tracking my progress, actively monitoring each step I took toward the truth. And they weren't trying to stop me. Not yet. They were trying to slow me down. That raised the stakes in a way I wasn't prepared for. Now there were two possibilities, neither comforting. One, someone wanted to protect the system and prevent the mistake from being exposed. Two, someone wanted me to expose it but only on their terms. Both paths led to the same frightening conclusion. I wasn't in control anymore. A new layer of conflict began unfolding when I checked the envelope again and noticed a tiny black smudge near the flap. It wasn't dirt or ink. It looked like residue from a security tag, the kind used on official government documents. Which meant whoever sent the envelope had access to places I didn't. They weren't just someone with information, they were someone inside. Someone who knew more about the mistake than anyone else. Someone who understood the full scale of the damage. Someone who knew how dangerous it would be if I uncovered it too quickly. And that realization introduced the second plot twist I wasn't expecting. I had never been hunting alone. Someone had been shaping my path from the very beginning. Someone who had just made it clear that the truth I was chasing was far more dangerous than I ever imagined. And for the first time since Sam disappeared, I felt the eerie certainty that I was no longer the one following the clues. The clues were following me. For a long moment after that mysterious phone call, I just sat there staring at the dark screen, letting the silence settle around me. My mind kept replaying that voice, the calm tone, the strange familiarity. It felt like someone had stepped out from behind the curtain and whispered directly into my ear. And as unsettling as it was, it also pushed something inside me forward. If someone knew my pace, my steps, my progress, then maybe it meant my search was almost over. The climax of this entire hunt had already begun, and all I needed was one final piece to click into place. The next morning, I woke up with one thought repeating in my mind: go back to the beginning. All this time I'd been moving outward, new names, new documents, new connections. But the list left at my door, the warning typed at the bottom, and the faint handwritten line pressed on the back, they all pointed me backward. To the people most connected to the original mistake. To the earlier revision in 2015. To the one person who linked everything together, even though he disappeared years before any of this began. The same person whose name appeared in the burned file. So I did something I'd avoided for a long time. I visited his family. I didn't tell them the full story, I couldn't. But they welcomed me inside, remembering me as someone who used to be close to him. His mother led me to his old room, still untouched. Dust settled on the bookshelves, sunlight creeping in through thin curtains. As I looked around, I felt a mixture of familiarity and sadness. He had been brilliant, curious, always poking at things that didn't quite add up. Maybe that curiosity was what set everything in motion. His father stepped inside quietly and handed me a small cardboard box. "He wanted you to have this," the man said softly. "He told us once, if you ever came looking, give it to you." The box was light. Too light. But inside was a flash drive wrapped in an old receipt. One line written on the paper in his handwriting said, "This explains the first error. The second one explains you." My hands went cold. I thanked them, left as politely as I could, and sat in my car for almost 10 minutes before I even started the engine. The box sat on the passenger seat like it weighed 100 pounds. When I finally got home, I plugged the drive into my laptop with a kind of fear that didn't come from danger. It came from knowing what I was about to see might change everything. Inside the drive were 3 folders. The first was labeled 2015 Revision. The second was labeled Repeat Error. The third was simply named U. I opened the first folder. It was filled with reports, some old, some incomplete. They described a small government system update, something routine. But one technical line stood out: a change in data categorization that accidentally pushed thousands of records into an incorrect index. That was the first mistake. A simple oversight that caused long-term ripple effects. Lost records, mismatched information, people receiving wrong notifications, some cases never resolved. It wasn't malicious, just poorly checked and quickly approved. Then I opened the second folder. This one explained what happened when the correction was attempted a year later. A well-intentioned update meant to fix the original problem accidentally duplicated the error in a different section of the system. The same flawed category logic was used again, copied from the original file instead of rewritten. That was the repeat error. 2 mistakes built on the same outdated code. And the frightening part was that everyone assumed the update worked because the system didn't show the error clearly. So the mistake hid itself again. That's why so many people got involved. That's why the names on the list appeared. That's why documents went missing, not because someone was hiding them but because the system was burying them under faulty indexing. The missing attachments, the lost reports, the timelines that didn't match, they were all victims of the same 2 connected mistakes. A heavy relief washed over me mixed with frustration. The truth wasn't some dark conspiracy. It was a failure that grew quietly, unnoticed because no one looked closely enough at the original code. And the people who did notice, like Sam, like Layla, like the person from my past, were overwhelmed by how complicated the issue was. They didn't vanish because someone forced them out. They stepped back because they didn't know how to handle the scale of it, or because the system corrected itself too slowly to show clear evidence. Then I opened the third folder. Inside was only one document. A message addressing me directly, written years before I ever got involved. If you're reading this, it means I never got the chance to explain the truth to you myself. You were connected to this long before you realized it. The second update used a dataset you once worked on during your internship years ago. That dataset still had traces of the original categorization error. Not your fault, not your doing, just timing and coincidence. But it means you were always part of the chain. Not guilty. Just connected. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. Everything suddenly made sense. My name wasn't on the list because I was targeted. It was there because I was part of the timeline. One small piece of data he had handled years before ended up being used during the second update. It was accidental, unavoidable, and strangely poetic. My involvement in this story started long before I even knew it existed. The phone call also made sense now. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning from someone inside the system who realized I was digging in the wrong direction. They weren't trying to hide the truth, they were trying to prevent me from assuming the worst, from thinking the system was working against people intentionally. They wanted me to see the whole picture before jumping to conclusions. A week after finding the flash drive, I met with a small group inside the department responsible for the revisions. They were cautious at first, unsure of how much I knew. But once I showed them the documentation from both folders, the room shifted. They weren't defensive. They were relieved. They explained that the issue had finally been flagged internally 2 years ago, and teams had been working on untangling it quietly to prevent confusion or panic. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was progress. I shared everything I found and they listened carefully. Some of them looked genuinely shocked at how far the effects had spread without anyone noticing. They thanked me for piecing together the human side of the mistake, something their systems couldn't show. As for the people on the list, most of them were contacted with updates. Some received apologies. Others got clarity about situations that confused them for years. Closure came slowly, gently, and without drama. Looking back, I realized the whole journey wasn't about exposing corruption or fighting a powerful system. It was about understanding how small government mistakes, quiet, simple, overlooked, can shape real lives in ways no spreadsheet can measure. And how important it is for someone to pay attention, not to accuse but to ask the right questions. That was my takeaway. That was the lesson hidden inside all the confusion. Mistakes don't have to be malicious to cause damage. They just need to go unnoticed. And sometimes the most important thing we can do is look closer. My search ended not with a dramatic confrontation, but with clarity, soft, steady, and long overdue. The truth wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And honesty, after everything, felt like the resolution I had been hunting from the very beginning.